Oh, sorry, I was muted, so it's better with the mic. I start again. Deepfakes and automated content creation. Hello, you are connected to the brand new AI&Law webinar of the Council of Europe and the University of Strasbourg. I am your host, Yannick Menesser, and I will accompany you with Juliette Lelieur in this program to better understand this technological application, which are amusing, but also somehow frightening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our AI and Law webinar. I will start with presenting our three experts for today. Our first expert is Sebastian Hallensleben from Germany. You see his picture on the left. After various experiences in IT and leadership roles in telecoms and financial services, Sebastian created strategies for the German government on high-tech research policy and open innovation. Today, he is head of digitalization in one of the largest engineering associations, VDE or VDE. Sebastian also chairs the Sensenelec AI focus group in Europe, as well as the special group on AI ethics and the global ICE, and the ICE is International Electronical Commission. I now turn to our second expert, Karen Melker, who is a Danish lawyer, and she also graduated at the French École Nationale de l'Administration, sorry. She's a politician of the Danish Social Liberal Party and a foreign policy specialist. Karen has been serving as a member of the European Parliament since 2019, and I'm sure that she will give us insight into the recent evolutions on AI at the European Parliament. Finally, we are welcoming a third expert, Pavel Gladyshev. Pavel is a lecturer at the University College Dublin, where he established 2 Master in Sciences programs in the field of digital forensics, a Master Science in Forensic Computing and Cybercrime Investigation, and a Master in Science in Digital Investigation and Forensic Computing. Pavel has been working with law enforcement since 1998, when he oversaw the creation of the first training course in cybercrime investigation for the Irish National Police Service.
Thanks a lot, Juliette, for this introduction. And during this webinar, you will have access to the chat on Blue Jeans and also the question and answer. So do not hesitate to engage with our speaker and post your question if you wish. I would like now to give the floor to Jan Claessen first and then Claudia Luciani for brief opening words on this webinar on deepfake and automated content creation. Jan, you can connect to us and begin to speak.
Thank you very much, Yannick. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, Juliette. Merci, remerciements à l'Université de Strasbourg for helping us to organize this webinar. 2 very interesting themes, and you already haven't introduced them. On the one hand, deepfakes, and on the other hand, and perhaps next to it, automated text creation. Both possibilities to create, or some might say manipulate, visual images, audio images, of course, and also written texts. Deepfakes, that is to say, a technique that can animate someone's face and make him or her say things that she or he never said, can be, of course, very amusing. It can be great fun at parties or in satirical programs. But, of course, it also carries real risks. It carries risks for human rights. People may be put in all sorts of embarrassing situations, as one can easily imagine. It carries risks for the rule of law and for democracy. One can easily think about politicians being manipulated, and as I said, a number of popular television programs and also YouTubers already use cheap fakes to make fun of politicians and other public figures. But of course, it could also be very easily manipulated. As to the rule of law, think about the admissibility of evidence, video or audio in courtrooms. With the increase of cheap fakes and deep fakes, of course, courts may at some point decide that they will not so easily allow audio or visual evidence to be presented, for instance, in criminal cases, which might lead to all sorts of problems for law enforcement. And of course, there are also human rights issues if people are framed, as it were, by opponents or whoever in order to be charged with crimes or statements they never committed. So there's a lot of issues here, and I'm sure that during this webinar we'll hear much more about it. Also, as regards how to address this issue in future. Now, we're not starting from scratch. Have human rights instruments and rule of law instrument treaties that already do apply to certain aspects of these problems. We have, of course, the European Convention on Human Rights. We have the Cybercrime Convention. We have the Convention on Data Protection, all Council of Europe conventions, and further legal instruments are in the making, notably a general text or texts on artificial intelligence that is currently being prepared by the Council of Europe special body called CAHAI, and other texts are also on their way. Our colleagues in the European Union, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Karen about that, are also dealing with this issue. The European Commission has very recently launched a proposal for AI regulation, which will now be discussed in the various EU bodies. And of course, as Council of Europe, we very much hope to be part of that discussion, just as the European Union is part of the discussions we're having in Strasbourg. The aim of this webinar is to shed some further light, as I said at the beginning, on the possibilities and also on the possible safeguards we can introduce to ensure that the fun applications will stay, the creative applications will stay, but that the abuses will not take place. So I'm particularly happy to welcome such brilliant experts as Karen, Sebastian, and Pavel to this meeting. And I look very much forward to following your presentations, and I'm sure we'll all learn a lot. And would like to invite Claudia perhaps to continue the introduction on behalf of the Council. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Jan. Yes, we will invite Claudia. The connection is not so stable with her, so we are going to do our best, and sorry for that. Claudia, you can try to take the floor.
Okay, here I am. I hope you can see me and hear me. And
yes, very good.
In turn, I would like... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, Claudia.
Okay. In turn, I would like to say how excited and happy I am to be looking forward to hearing from our three distinguished guests and experts. I just want to say a couple of words when it comes to what are some of my main concerns that refer to democratic matters. Of course, we know that propaganda and trying to rig elections are not new phenomena. They have been existing probably as long as people have been in voting. But of course, the new applications you're going to be speaking about and deepfakes, automated text creation, may indeed impact on what we believe are fundamental tenets of democracy. That is an open public space and the holding of free and fair elections. So I just want to briefly address these two. Public space that we expect to allow for at least two essential elements. One is pluralism of views, and the second is contradictory debate. Actually, we want more. We want also the debate to be based on objective, reliable, and falsifiable information, as Karl Popper tells us. Now, it's clear that the borderline between argumentation or contradictory debate and manipulation can at times be extremely fine, as we have seen throughout the health crisis. And we've also realized how important it has been to have objective, reliable, and verifiable information during the crisis. Now, how do we make sure that these new systems preserve the public space and these indispensable features? Cambridge Analytica affair revealed that micro-targeting advertising techniques could allow propaganda to go from small scale to bigger scale with possible interference. Now, is the scale of such targeting a real menace to free and fair elections? How do we measure the scale of the problem? Or are we speaking about a group of phenomena that remain in statistically irrelevant percentage in the elections field, that is 2%, and do not infringe, therefore, on results and trust in the system of voting? These experts we have today, I'm pretty sure, can help us to better tackle these questions. We have a good combination of expertise in AI and, of course, political experience that I'm looking forward to hearing. We need such insight at the Council of Europe because we want to make sure we understand and we differentiate between the different fears or real threats. And we understand the extent of the challenge as we have to propose action to our member states. As you know, our job is indeed to accompany our member states on these reflections, and the variety of their response varies very much. So I'm sure that with your help, with your insights, we will be able to better understand, again, these the differences of threats and the impact they have on our fundamental principles. And with that, we will probably be able to understand whether we need new dedicated standards, for instance, to ensure that our democratic principles are safely kept, both in the physical and the virtual space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan and Claudia, for this introduction. It's always very nice to have you and your support for these webinars. We'll turn to our first expert, Sebastian Hallensleben, sorry. Do you hear me, Sebastian?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, so Sebastian will tell us about technical possibilities and the challenge to democracy, business, and judiciary. So, Sebastian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Juliette. Thank you, Yannick, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event. Jan Kleis and Claudia Luciano have provided the perfect introduction that I can directly expand on. As you might expect, for a topic like this, it is necessary to show pictures. So I will share my screen, and since this worked perfectly in advance, I'm fairly sure it'll work perfectly now as well. Just for those of you who are not familiar with my organization, VDE, it's an old organization, the largest engineering association in the European Union. We create bridges from research to application. We are in charge of safety and performance testing, and we are the one half of standardization in Germany through our DKE pillar. So I'd like to kick off with these pictures of some very nice and friendly people, very different types of people. You can form your opinion on who you like, who you might not like so much. You can guess what those people are like. Now, those of you familiar with the topic might already guess the punchline for all this. None of these people exist. These are actually demonstration faces that were generated by AI. And this website here is still up, and every time you click reload, you get a fresh face that was automatically generated. And it is very, very hard to distinguish that, or to tell that this is actually not a real person. And you can see on this little timeline that the progress in this field has been extremely rapid, and from just some blurry, grainy resemblance of a face to a pretty much perfect face has just been a few years, and we're already 3 years further into the future now. Also, of course, everyone knows deepfakes in various modes of usage. Here is an example where an actor actually imprints his visual expression, his facial expression onto another person who then twisted her face like this, and many other applications of deepfakes, both, as Jan said, both the fun ones and the dangerous. And progress is illustrated in particular by the fact that less and less input material is needed to animate a face. So here's a recent example or demonstration from an ancestry website where people can upload a single family pictures, and that one single photo is enough to actually animate the face. As has already been mentioned, we're not only talking about AI generating images and video, we're also talking about AI generating text. This is a very simple example of generated by GPT-3. We have a few bullet points, and GPT-3 turns those bullet points into a very well-formed, nice email. And you can imagine these bullet points could, for example, also be characteristics of a product that you want to turn into a product review, or it could be political talking points that you turn into a forum comment, or many different forum comments. Because what GPT-3 is able to do, in contrast to its predecessor, GPT-2, it can create text in multiple speaking styles. A sentence, what I cannot create, I cannot understand, which might have been uttered by famous physicist Richard Feynman, can be turned into a clickbait style text. Are we smarter than a Turing machine? That sort of says the same thing or a similar thing, but was never written down by a human being and just automatically generated. And you see in the middle a nice drop down list with all sorts of other options as well. Now, GPT-3 can not only generate human-readable text, GPT-3 can also generate code, because code ultimately is also text, and that code could, for example, describe a website. So you can tell GPT-3, as you see on the left-hand side, please create a website like stripe.com that is about a chat app. And that very, very simple prompt is enough for GPT-3 to actually create the code for a website that has those characteristics and is, at least at a superficial level, functional as well. And you can imagine similar applications, for example, a prompt to say, well, I'd quite like to have a diploma from Harvard University in a certain name with a top grade, of course, or I'd like a clone of the website of a rating agency that just happens to be modified to advise investing in a particular company to manipulate stock quotes. And you can put all these technical possibilities together and start from a very small prompt. In this case, in the example, a young black woman with long hair that works in finance, lives in Boston and loves cats. That prompt is enough for AI to generate a whole profile that could, for example, sit on LinkedIn or other networking sites with a credible profile picture, with a credible background, credible career history, and even the possibility to chat with that quotes person. And as a final example, I'd like to point out a recent startup has emerged in the US quite recently, R1.ai, where it's actually enough to upload 7 minutes of video of any person for this system to create an AI clone that can then present arbitrary online learning content, that can answer customer support questions, that can show around prospective customers in a virtual tour of real estate for sale, or even conduct simple interviews. So that is also already possible and already in the market today. So where does it leave us? In the old world, we had people and their content online. It was all very nice and simple. But then AI automated content and convincing bots started to emerge. And those bots and that content started to become better and better and closer to human beings and their content, to the point where those two can no longer be distinguished. And we're also now in a world where the content might not be benign content. It could be manipulated stock bars. It could be fake product reviews. It could be mass fabricated content, comments, putting any particular political view, or it could be, in fact, simulated political majority, where one person pretends to be a large segment of the population. We also have the technical capability to create YouTube influencers, to create fake news presenters and reporters, to have those influencers acquire followers, interact with those followers, and so on. And as Jan already pointed out, we've of course got the opportunity to fabricate evidence, which not only disturbs the judicial process from the fabrication point of view, but also because it destroys trust and leads to real evidence possibly being rejected. And so we do have serious consequences, as Claudia has pointed out in the introduction, for democracy, if we are unable to distinguish truth from lies, and if we erode trust in information and also trust in other people, because we never know is it a real person or a bot, we suffocate political discourse and we make it impossible to have the constructive discussions that lead to consensus and that ultimately allow democracy to function. In the judiciary, a loss of trust is almost a death sentence for the legal system. It can't work without trust in the system. In business, we have a situation where products and services no longer sell based on their quality or on the reputation of the manufacturer, but they sell based on who has been able to mobilize the larger number of bots and who's been able to deceive better. And this is turning into the primary mode of competition. And finally, for platforms, be they small or large platforms, a flood of fake content comes with a risk of liability and a risk of losing reputation. And of course, on a purely commercial level, with an escalation of moderation costs. So how do we deal with this? How do we approach this? Now, there is a quick standard answer that says, well, if there are fabrications out there, we just build AI-based tools that detect those fakes. And there are, in fact, many tools around, some offered by big companies, by small companies, profit, non-profit. There are numerous activities to detect and spot fakes. But of course, as soon as you have a detection tool, you can train your fabrication tool to become better, to produce more convincing fakes, which in turn leads to the detection tool taking the next leap and trying to get better again. So you have this arms race between fabrication tools and detection tools that is necessary, that we do need to enter, but on its own, it's not enough to really win, to really gain the upper hand over fakes and bots. So we need a game changer. We need a way to pick out again, to identify again in this flood of people and content online, the ones that are real human beings and the content that has been created by those real human beings. Now, you could argue, well, that's easy. We already have a way of proving who is real and who is not. You can go online and verify yourself with your real name. We've got infrastructure through certain ID cards, through tokens, through documents, through frameworks such as self-sovereign identity. So it is possible already to be trusted online and to prove that oneself is a human being. And that's already clearly a step up from going online with an unverified name, where there's always competition with bots and clones, and everyone can even tell you, well, you're probably just a bot because I can't really tell whether you're real. The downside is that in these cases, your identity becomes public. And there are many, many good reasons and instances where you do not want that to happen, where you want to preserve privacy, be it in a whistleblowing situation, be it in the context of a politically oppressive regime, be it because you want to keep professional and private lives separate, or be it in any commercially sensitive context. There are many good reasons and many good instances where you do want to keep your real identity confidential. You can do that. You can protect your identity by going online anonymously. But then again, you're still untrusted, and you can be confused with all those AI-generated bots and clones. So we really have a gap here. We have a gap. We're missing a quadrant, a way of going online where your identity is protected, but at the same time, you can prove that you're a human being and therefore can be trusted as a human being. So what needs to go into that quadrant? We call this authentic pseudonyms. Pseudonyms because, yes, you need a name. It shouldn't be a real name. It should be a pseudonym. But it has to be authentic in the sense that it satisfies two important characteristics. First of all, such authentic pseudonyms must be guaranteed to belong to a physical person. And second, those pseudonyms must be singular in a given context. So if I create such a pseudonym for myself, for example, on a particular news website, then it must not be possible for me to create 100 or 1,000 pseudonyms on that same news website, because then again, I can just launch 100 or 1,000 bots. It must be restricted to one per context or one per platform. Those may sound like fairly demanding technical requirements, but in fact, there are already at least two ways of satisfying those requirements. One is a standard that is actually in the optional part of the IDES specification and in fact implemented in certain ID cards already. The example here is the German ID card that allows creating such pseudonyms without ever revealing the real identity. And it's also possible to create such pseudonyms as an additional layer on top of or within the framework of self-sovereign identity, which of course has the problem that it's not tied to any specific capability in a particular ID card in a specific country. So these are two examples of trust anchors that are already known to work. The first one is already up and running and has been for many years, even though it's not used so far. And the second one is very close in terms of being usable and would have a global reach. And you can think further in this direction to the whole ecosystem of trust there around authentic pseudonyms. You can imagine trust transparency networks, trust estimation protocols. You can imagine identity trustees and as a special variant of data trustees and so on. So to summarize, what do we actually get if we manage to fill this missing quadrant through this specific kind of pseudonyms? We actually build something, we have the chance to build something that avoids the authoritarian approach, but still solves the challenge of AI-generated fakes and bots. We promote sovereignty in that we are not necessarily relying on the identities that might be provided by large commercial companies, global internet companies. We make a leap from the old principle underpinning democracy, one person, one vote, to an additional principle in the digital space, which we call one person, one voice. If we hear a voice, we want to hear all voices. It's essential for the functioning of democracy, but we want to be sure that each voice maps to one person. And finally, as a side effect, if you do have pseudonyms like this, it is actually possible to sustainably block people who abuse a platform rather than them being able to come back with a different name 2 minutes later. So I'd like to leave it there as an overview. We do have a technology challenge, a massive challenge. We do have a gap in the way we handle digital identities, but at the same time, we already have the means to close this gap, to fill this missing quadrant, and to build ourselves a pseudonym identity infrastructure for European countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian, for this very insightful presentation. And you describe a brand new word, or maybe our already current existing word. Maybe I'm myself a deep fake. No, I joke. I'm real. I'm real.
You would say that.
I can attest it.
But what strikes me is that you mentioned possible issues with different applications and your thoughts about the convergence that is not different problems, but which is one problem can find a technological solution. And I really appreciate your thoughts and insight about that. But we will let the floor now to our second speaker. And thanks a lot, Sebastian. We will come back to you just after, during the discussion. I would like to give the floor to our second expert today, to Karen Melker, because you propose, Sebastian, and I think it's very interesting, of course, a kind of technological answer, but also from policymakers that could be, in my opinion, answer from that point of view. So I will let the floor to Karen to see from the point of view of the member of the European Parliament, what could be political or answer from law also to be able to answer to these challenges. Karen, the floor is yours.
You said that we were going to hear from an expert, so I, of course, understood that we were going to hear from somebody else other than me.
No.
But as a member of the European Parliament, I'm very happy to be at least virtually back in Strasbourg, where I haven't been for more than a year now. I think deepfakes and also deepfake text is an issue that we need to deal with quite seriously. But I think that it is the wrong approach to see a technical solution to a problem with the technicalities. I'm just going to change the view so that I'm not looking at myself in some way. So you'll be able to see me, but I'm not looking at myself. That trying to fix a technical problem, misuse of technology with more technology, I think this is a false solution. We will only reach success for a limited period of time. We have, as also the introduction showed us, we have a sort of legislative, regulatory competition in the field of AI at the moment. We both have a lot of activity going on in the European Council, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm getting it wrong. Council of Europe, anyway, and not only in the European Union, looking at how to regulate artificial intelligence. And I think it's important that we use the developments that there are both in the Council of Europe and in the European Union, but also in places like the OSCE and the OECD. Their parliamentary assembly is also looking into how to regulate and how to encourage good use of artificial intelligence. And the important thing is that we don't do this in silos, but that the different tracks of regulation, that we allow them to converge and learn from each other. We have in the European Parliament, we have what is called STOA, which is sort of our future-proofing and scientific board that is collaborating with the OECD. And I think having such cross-institutional organizational collaborations is really important. I think we need to look at this from an angle of media freedom and cybersecurity, but also of making sure that our journalists and our general public have a more skeptical approach to videos and text being shared, that they have an understanding of how to verify if something is true or not. I strongly believe that if you start out with if it's good to be true, too good to be true, it's probably not true starting point. So, and that can go from anything from emails allowing you to become a millionaire overnight because somebody died in a plane crash, or sexy bots on Twitter, or handsome American generals wanting to be in touch with you. We need to make sure that we have a skeptical approach to what we see. Where I see a particular danger is in a fast-moving area such as foreign policy and political developments, where deepfakes can be used to create videos of events that have never taken place in disputed areas and disputed territories. The recent conflict in Gaza and Israel, I haven't seen any proof of any deepfakes being used, but I would not be surprised if in the future that this could be a step or a tool that is being used by forces on either side of a conflict that is as hotly disputed as the conflict there. And in the sort of fog of war, then I think we will have difficulty in fact-checking things quickly enough. But I think we can make sure that we have structures that allow us to deal with the information that we are given on a more human scale, at the human element, to make sure that we have somebody checking if this is too good to be true, if who would benefit from this piece of information being shared, and what the consequences would be if we take this as at letter value. One thing we also need to look at is the way that deepfakes can be, and also online propaganda can be used to sway electoral systems. I have a kind of radical solution for that, but I'm not quite sure if most states are willing to take that solution. We need to reform our electoral systems so that it is not a few votes in a single constituency that can decide the fate of an entire election for the entire country. I think the first past the post system that you have in the UK and in other countries where you don't have a proportionate electoral system is very vulnerable to propaganda and to deepfakes. And I think that societies and governments should consider electoral reform as a way of society addressing the problem of deepfakes and AI. And I'm sorry for sort of talking around the subject very much, but I think we need to look at AI and deepfakes in a wider societal angle to make sure that we have a robust electoral system and that we have robust media systems. We have a robust level of education amongst our general public and ourselves, so that we understand the world that we're living in. The European Commission came with its first proposal for how to regulate AI. And it is a very technology neutral proposal. We are looking at bans on certain uses of AI, and we are looking at AI use that is considered high risk, and we're looking at AI that is considered use of AI that is considered low risk. And I think this is a good way of approaching it because we don't know what technologies that we will see in the future right now. So we need to look at the use of AI more than the individual technology at hand. But where do the bans and the high risk start and stop? At the moment, we have an issue regarding live remote biometric identification, which is looking at, for example, facial recognition from a distance through CCTV cameras that is banned by law enforcement agencies in the proposal from the Commission. And I think that this is a very good starting point, but we might have to look at that even further to see, should we also ban, for example, use of gender or ethnic attribution via biometric identification. When we're looking at deepfakes and the abbreviation of GPT-3 text programming, I think it's important to see who are able to use this and what can it be used for. A ban or moratorium could be an approach. As far as I understand, Microsoft have limited the access to the source code, but that it is available through the API. And this is one way. But what I'm worried about as a legislator is if we ban the legal uses of the technology, then it might only be the criminals left that are using it. And that will not really address the problems of electoral influence, propaganda from foreign actors, interference in our democracies. And I think this is perhaps a too easy approach to this use. I think the solution is not only having a technical approach, but also a sort of more human angle. And an outright ban is not the only approach, because if the technology is out there, then it will be used or misused. I also come from a background of having worked with weapons of mass destruction, or not really with the weapons, but the deterrence and the destruction or control of the use of weapons of mass destruction. And I think we need to look at similar instruments that we have there within the UN, for example, and also within export controls to try and have some limits to these technologies. The problem is that they're no longer physical, like chemical weapons would be, and therefore they are a lot more difficult to control. We're looking at also a Digital Services Act proposal from the Commission that we're looking at in the European Parliament at the moment. And there one of the aspects is how users, for example, present themselves on platforms. There we have a distinction between having a private user on platforms, and that would be presenting content and opinions. And then if you are a salesperson presenting your products on a platform, where we ask the platforms, well, the Commission asks the platforms to have a know your customer obligation. So they need to know who the seller is of a certain product on their platform. I liked the idea of having a verified pseudonym on platforms, but I am still apprehensive of having a technological fix to a societal problem here as well, because if we say that you need to identify yourself to have a pseudonym, and there are criminals that want to present themselves to have more than one voice per organization or per person, then I think this could lead into identity theft and problems in that accord, so that they could have multiple profiles by misusing identity cards from others. And as I started out by saying, I feel a little bit guilty in being presented as an expert, because what I usually say is I know enough to know that I don't know a lot. So I'm really grateful for having been invited here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your contribution. It's very interesting that you draw a difference between a technological answer, a legal answer, a human answer, a globalized system answer from our societies to the phenomenon of deepfakes. And maybe we'll have questions later on how the proposal act, AI Act, the recent proposal of April 21, deals with the question of transparency of the person using deepfakes. Okay, now we'll turn to the law enforcement part, and I'll invite Pavel to join us. So Pavel will tell us about digital forensics and deepfakes, how to fight against criminal uses of deepfakes, and AI automated text creation. Do you hear me, Pavel?
Yes, hello, Juliet. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
So I'm also a little bit humbled to be called an expert on this topic. I'm specializing in digital who have interest in this field. And it was extremely interesting to listen to what Sebastian and Karen had to say earlier today. So what can a forensic scientist say about AI and the possibility of deepfakes that can be created? First, I want to clarify that forensics means application of science and scientific method to answer questions that arise in litigation. And although forensic scientists can be asked many different questions, I think the two main ones related to deepfakes are the question of authentication. Is this video real or is it fake? And second question is that of identification. Suppose we think that this video is a fake and we have a suspect who we suspect created it. Can we forensically prove that this video was produced by the equipment owned by this individual? And in the context of authentication, I think we have three different areas where we need to decide whether a particular piece of media is fake or not. First, obviously, is in the court of law. Second, in mass media. And the third one in biometrics. And I know that Sebastian said earlier that fabricated evidence is a problem. Now, I would like to say that perhaps it's not such a big problem as one might think, because legal systems have evolved in the world where all kinds of unreliable evidence exist. And any legal system has built-in mechanisms that prevent it from considering unreliable evidence. For example, suppose we have a political leader speaking on camera about something controversial. If such a video was to be presented in court, the judge and the investigators would realize that the political leader is probably speaking to other people, and instead of relying on the video to make a decision, they would invite these individuals into court to testify, where they can be examined and cross-examined. Most legal systems require the most reliable evidence to be used. And when we have a video and a video of questionable nature, every instinct, I think, of the legal system is against relying on this kind of information. There are some situations where the actual individuals may no longer be available. For example, a suicide note recorded on a camera. And in that case, the legal system has safeguards in the form of evidential process. When the police arrives at the scene of suicide, the forensic expert would collect the video camera that was used to record this suicide note, and then this evidence would be processed and accounted for at all times. So the process surrounding acquisition of evidence ensures that when this information is presented in court, it's highly unlikely that the evidence was tampered with. Now, especially in criminal court, where the guilt or innocence may have very serious consequences for the accused, unreliable evidence will not be used by the nature of the legal system. In civil litigation, however, for example, when we have a video note stating somebody's will or change of will post-mortem, unreliable evidence can be presented and considered. And in this situation, the opposing party may ask forensic expert to find clues that suggest that this video is not genuine. But again, I want to point out that this would not be a matter of life and death. It would be a matter of fine or penalty. So it's less severe case, shall we say. And for the purposes of legal proceedings, forensic expert would look for some information that can be readily presented in the court of law and be made understandable to the jurors or to the judge. Now, if we move into mass media, what had been discussed about earlier today, obviously we have a problem that unverified sources may present all sorts of messages, and it's well known that there are always people in the society who would believe whatever you tell them. So for the purposes of counter-propaganda, again, if we want to influence masses in that way, we need clear, easily understandable explanation of why a particular piece of information is fake. And then if we move into biometrics, it becomes even more complicated, because not only we have fake producer of the information, we also have automatic verifier. And here we get into the arms race that Sebastian has elaborated a little bit upon, and quite rightfully Karen suggested that certain uses of AI, such as remote CCTV biometrics, are safer to be prohibited because of the consequences of this arms race. So these are three areas, I think, with the criminal proceedings being most safe, I suppose, because of the way criminal proceedings work. Now I have a very small presentation, literally just one slide that I want to share with you, just to point out what a forensic expert might look at when deciding a particular piece of media, fake or not. So just bear with me for a second. So I will speak just about the deepfakes for the moment. Okay. Now, it's important to realize that when we create a piece of media, a movie, it's a combination of multiple input factors that create the actual artifact. And there is a long way from a source of the image all the way to the consumer. And these factors can roughly be subdivided into environment, person, camera, and post-processing. So any movie is created in some physical environment, which is a physical place with certain lighting condition, and this lighting condition should agree with the final product and other information, for example, information recorded by the camera about where and when this particular piece of media was produced. At a more microscopic level, for example, if we record a video in a room with artificial lighting, very often we can spot tiny flickering of the lights in sync with the alternating current in the mains electrical supply. And by detecting fluctuations of this flickering, we can go as far as geolocate the place where a particular movie was created. Similarly, when we have a person speaking on camera, they have their unique characteristics, which are not easily reproduced by the existing technology. I think Sebastian has quite clearly indicated that there was a huge progress over the past 5 to 6 years in the quality of fake imagery produced. However, it's still not entirely perfect. And for an actual physical human, we can expect a slight variation in color of the face, for example, that represents heart beating. The reflections of the light in the eyes of the person needs to follow the laws of physics, and if we have a source of light at a particular distance in front of the speaker, there are certain reflections that we can expect on the eyes of the person. And the currently most advanced generative adversarial networks, which are used to generate fake images, they're not very good at it yet. So we can sometimes determine it by spotting different reflections in different eyes of the individual. Similarly, when we speak, the tissues of our face, which are quite complex, they react in a manner which is not always correctly reproduced by the fake videos. And there are other signs. In the past, when the quality was not so good, sometimes you could get a person with different color of the eyes, misaligned facial features, but it's been improving steadily, and it's likely that it will continue to improve. Next, we have camera or microphone, actual sensors that receive physical reality and convert it into digital picture. And when we look at the specific camera, it has its own unique properties. For instance, if we know that a particular camera was used to shoot a particular movie, and we still have this camera, we can determine physical characteristics of the digital sensor, such as photoresponse non-uniformity. It's a unique fingerprint of any camera sensor, which is caused by the manufacturing process. And once it's established, it gives us quite a reliable way to determine whether a particular picture was produced with this particular camera. Also, we can use it to spot any alterations in the image by non-AI means. Now, once the audio and video had been recorded, the data enters post-processing stage, where various adjustments can be applied. Image can be heavily compressed, colors adjusted, and a lot of other things. And then camera and the post-processing process, they produce some data about their output. That's called metadata, and that might include the geographical location where the image or video was taken, type of equipment, processing that was applied to it, date and time, and so on. And when forensic specialist examines a piece of media, they try to find irregularities considering all of these different pieces of information. So as I said at the beginning, if, for example, the video says that it was shot in Africa, and on the video we see snow, then it's either Kilimanjaro or it's fake. That sort of reasoning goes on. And I suppose if you want to understand about reliability of forensic inferences, the best example I can give you is probably relates to human DNA. DNA profiling, I think, and that's my personal opinion, that it's considered very reliable because up to this point, we do not have easy way of spoofing human DNA. And because it's hard to produce fake human DNA, DNA evidence is reliable. Once we find out easy ways to do it, DNA evidence will probably be much less reliable. But however, we can improve our forensic findings by finding a lot of corroborating evidence. And although it's possible to create media, video, images, texts, which are virtually indistinguishable from the original, when we investigate someone's activities, criminal activities, we are often looking for a failure and for a mistake. And if a criminal is committing crimes for a period of time, mistakes are unavoidable. And that's what allows us ultimately to bring them to justice. So now, if we speak about the second question, that of identification, suppose where does it come up? Suppose we have a fake video or a fake text message that was used to bypass security controls of an organization. And through different channels, the police have apprehended that suspect, arrested them, and seized their computer equipment. And the forensic expert might be asked to look at the software available on the computer system of that individual and the fake piece of media. And the question might be asked, was this piece of media produced by this software or by this equipment? And it turns out that when we speak about deepfakes, specific neural networks, they have features in the produced videos which have similar characteristics as the photo response non-uniformity of specific cameras. So very often, specific neural networks can be linked to the videos they produce. And I presume that the same would apply to texts, to audio, and other kind of AI-generated media. So finally, I would say that I believe that the hope is not lost. I believe that even though we are in an arms race with the criminals, I believe there is always a way that relies on the human nature of criminals, investigators, the society, that allows us to answer questions related to law. And reflecting on what can we do about it, I think I sit somewhere in between of what Sebastian and Karen have proposed. On one hand, as a computer scientist, I do believe in technical solutions to human problems. So I fully support advanced security and trusted pseudonyms. However, understanding their limitations, I do believe that they are useful. And if you think of it, nowadays we have more and more digital security in our living. Only recently, my bank started accepting dual-factor authentication as a mandatory feature. 5 years ago, it was not required. So I think as a society, as individuals, we will have to get used to additional digital security. And on the societal side of things, I do believe that reforming electoral system and making it more robust is definitely a very good idea. But besides that, I think that as humans, we're not stupid. We know that there is a possibility of deepfakes, and just educating the general population by providing them examples of fake videos and what they should be aware of can have huge impact on the society in the very same way as information security education is helping to make our world more cyber secure. So I'll rest my case at that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Pavel, for your speech. And if I try to sum up a little bit what has been told now, we see that there is really two sides of the coin, if I may say. A technological answer, which is possible, and as you, Sebastian, and you, Pavel, you mentioned, authentic pseudonym, timestamp, hash code, and then a political and societal solution. And I also understand the point of view of Karen, and maybe we should try to mix solution. But let me go back to the polls that I launched during the Swiss speech. I asked to our audience 2 questions. There is another poll running now. So my first question is about deepfakes, and to know that if people have already have heard about that, and there is 74% that have already heard about that. So this is a quite well-known phenomenon. But when it comes to find again a solution, we see that between technological solution or political or law answers to control uses of deepfake, the answers are quite balanced, 52%, 48%. And we have on the chat some very interesting question, or just for educational purpose, can you give some address to access to deepfake? This is a kind of question or remarks we have on the chat or on the question and answer. We feel that there is an interest to play with that, at least. And maybe we will talk about cheap fakes a little bit later, because I launched another poll about cheap fakes to ask to our audience if they have used their cell phone, for instance, just to play with this very funny application. I don't talk about data protection at all. We don't know where are going all the data, of course, but I just launched the question. You can answer for the moment for 23 votes, and 91% have never tried on the cell phone. And my personal advice is take care of your personal data with cell phone, as simple as that. So I will conclude with that. And maybe, as we have no real question at this stage, maybe one, but we can mix with a question from our colleagues. One question is talking about Photoshop 2.0. We can already make a false picture with Photoshop, and they say we do not ban Photoshop, so why not? Why should we ban now deepfakes? It's an interesting reflection, of course. And the other one, let me go to that question. Just 2 seconds. Question. I quote the question: talk of banning pervasive technology is like banning Photoshop. Sorry, I already mentioned that. I am quite clumsy with my computer. And the question is here: how does more regulation can deal with that? This is a huge question, and during this discussion with speakers, maybe we can discuss about that.
Okay, so is there any one of you 3 who would like to answer the question about Photoshop, about why we don't prohibit Photoshop if we prohibit other, the tools we've spoken about today?
Pavel, maybe, or we do not ban Photoshop, it's true.
Well, my personal opinion is that we shouldn't we shouldn't ban anything, but we should be cautious. I usually give this example when speaking about information security. When we ban something, we do it to make our world a little bit more secure. A little bit like electric socket in the wall. It's covered with a plastic cover with 2 or 3 holes in it through which a particular plug fits in. And that prevents our children from roughly putting their fingers into it and getting electrocuted. If we remove the cover, then sometimes we can insert different kinds of plugs into the same socket. But now it's open, it's not very secure. Now we can make our socket even more usable if we use jumper cables, connect them to ground and the mains of the open socket, and have 2 clamps in our hands. Then we can power anything at all, but it's extremely unsafe. I think.
Don't try that at home.
Don't try it at home. So, I think it's the matter of the balance. So, do we want to be extremely patronizing and covering everything and making it extremely safe so that nobody can get in who shouldn't? Or can we adopt perhaps Amsterdam viewpoint that, as one of the street guides once told me, if you fall in the canal, well, you weren't thinking clearly, maybe, and you should have.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with Pavel there that it's a matter of balance, and I think taking our 3 contributions today together, we have all the ingredients that we need. I was mainly talking about the technological side. Karen was talking about the societal and political side. And Pavel was talking about the legal and forensic and scientific side. And I strongly agree, even though my own contribution focused on the technical aspect of the solution, I strongly agree with the point that we need all facets of it. I think we also have to make a distinction between deepfake video and GPT-3 faked text. In a video, you've got a lot of data to go on, and there is also plenty of opportunity for the fabricators to get it wrong. Pavel explained all the stages where little things can creep in that later trip up the fakes. If we look at text, we have a far smaller amount of data to go on. If we just look at the stream of comments on underneath a news article, where we haven't got a camera footprint, we haven't got, in the worst case, we haven't got any information, maybe a little bit of meta information of time or posting patterns, but that's very, very little. And as GPT-3 is becoming good enough to produce text that could be coming from a human, it becomes quite difficult to verify what is fake and what is real. And the disadvantage that we have is that the face can be automated, whereas the forensic analysis, in particular when it's a very, very good fake, is something that's always semi-manual, where you always put in the detective work to try and spot new little errors, and we're at a bit of at a disadvantage there. I'd also like to point out that, and this is maybe picking up on Karen's point about societal resilience. Karen pointed out that we need better media education as a way of making society more resilient to fakes, maybe more robust electoral systems. I would add to that a sort of emotional resilience, because even in a case where it's later turning out that, for example, a video from a war scene was fake, it's already been shared thousands or 1 million times. The emotional impact has already happened. And it's almost impossible to undo that emotional impact of having seen some purported atrocity of one side against the other. So we will need that sort of resilience as well, in terms of skepticism and in terms of avoiding to be emotionally impacted. And I think that might be the hardest challenges of all, because it's not education, it's actually going against our human nature.
Karen, would you like to add something to these answers?
I think it's, when looking at banning technologies, I think it's a question also of not banning the technology, but banning certain uses, and also making it more clear when the technology has been used. So declaring on a website if the chat function is manned by a bot rather than a human, declaring that the text has been generated by a bot or the new technology. I don't see it as problematic to have financial news or sports news automatically generated by artificial intelligence. It is creating more effective reporting based on dates and numbers and facts. But it would be problematic if you're using the same technologies for presenting fake profiles, fake news stories, trying to influence things. There, I think the approach that the European Commission has had with saying, well, there are certain uses of AI that we want to ban, but not the AI technology as such, is a quite good way of approaching this should we ban Photoshop or not question.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you all three for your answers. I'll now turn to Patrick Penangs, who is from the Council of Europe, and I think Patrick has a question for us. Patrick, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good.
I hope the same for you.
Yes, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the three inputs and then come with a question. The first thing is, a couple of weeks ago, the Dutch MEPs had a video conference which was afterwards seen to be a deep fake imitation of the chief of staff of the Russian opposition leader Navalny via Zoom. And of course, we are all at this point in time connected via a multitude of video applications that connect us together, but we don't really know. And Yannick was joking about it, of saying, well, I'm actually a fake. This becomes a difficulty. And I know that you have a legal forensic reply and a technological reply and maybe a political and societal reply to that. But the question and the issue is that the citizen, and not only the citizen, but also the citizens' representatives, are faced with a new situation in an era where disinformation and distrust, namely in the media, is at a historical low. So deepfakes are not going to be helpful to make things better in the current situation. And of course, I understand Sebastian Hallensleben that there may be technological responses such as pseudonym identity, etc., but that is not going to help our citizens. I think there needs to be some kind of regulation that can be developed in order to counter this. We do not have all the possibilities, and we do not have the forensic tools to discover whether something is actually a deep fake or not. We already have many difficulties in today's dispatch of disinformation on how to counter that disinformation, even if it is not using deep fakes. So the societal reply, the institutional reply, needs to be such that it also does not only look at what technologically able persons can do, and the ones that are very conscious of the development, and even though 75% of the people that are watching this webinar say that they have heard about deep fakes, well, they have already heard about it because they have connected to this webinar. But that does not mean that you can therefore decipher what is happening and that you can counter what is happening. The fact that GPT-3, for example, mimicking human writing of text, but also the increasing number of new breakthroughs that were identified, for example, in the MIT technology overview with the TikTok recommendations, remote everything, multi-skilled artificial intelligence, digital contact tracing, all of this mixes together. And that is where we need to have a clear guidance. I think that the digital AI package that is being proposed by the European Commission, and that is very much in line with what the Council of Europe is doing in terms of its ad hoc committee on artificial intelligence, and which uses the same starting point of human-centric development of artificial intelligence on the one side, and a risk-based approach on the other side. If we see the investment that is being made, for example, on facial recognition, on biometric recognition, a lot of these investments are done outside of Europe and outside the Western world. So I think it is important that we reconsider our positions on these issues, because they will certainly need to be answered, need to be given political, philosophical, humanitarian, and value-based ethos response to these developments. Thank you.
Patrick, sorry. Thank you, Patrick. So
now you're going to tell me that you didn't hear any of what I was saying, right?
Yes, I did. Of course, I did.
Okay.
Quite good. Quite good. You were asking for more regulation and for coordination between what's the.
I was asking for a clear response, and as I said, we have legal forensic issues that we can deal with, and technological, but we also need a citizen's response, a response that will satisfy the needs of the citizens in our democratic societies. That's not easy, and we may be playing catch up with technology in order to see, well, how can we create the pseudonymic identity? And I would very much agree with Karen Melker on that. Are we going to be forced into a situation where we all need to create a pseudonym identity in order to be able to survive in the digital world, or can we just be ourselves?
To be even more concrete, I would like to add that in the AI Act, in the proposal. In the AI Act proposal, Article 52, Section 3, at the moment it is, well, the solution that is concretely proposed is that, I quote, users of an AI system that generates or manipulates image, audio, or video content, shall disclose that the content has been artificially generated or manipulated. That's now the proposal of the European Commission. Well, the proposal has been adopted very recently. So is that enough? Very concretely, is that enough? Can we be satisfied? Are citizens being protected enough by this obligation of transparency? What if the transparency is not respected by the users? How do we appreciate that proposal for the moment?
If I can jump in there, I think this is actually one of at least three areas where I see the role of government and governmental institutions and regulations. Such transparency requirements will, of course, enforce certain standards in terms of transparency, at least have some incentive to follow the law. And that'll be the vast majority of people and institutions, and therefore it is important. But it will, of course, not deter criminals. Making crime illegal doesn't remove crime. So there are two other roles of governmental institutions that I think are necessary. One is, Patrick pointed it out. Well, this is getting complicated from a citizen's perspective, and I've got so many new things to take into account, and who can I trust? If we introduce new ways of moving online, for example, pseudonyms or other changes. Pavel mentioned the two-factor authentication earlier. It has to be something that is broadly used, and it has to be something that is used not only by a specific company, but, for example, also by governments. So as we now move into digitalizing more and more public services, it's important that for example, the authentication methods that are used there are consistent, that they are standardized, that people can have an opportunity to have a chance to get used to them, so that the interface to those services is as easy as it used to be to pick up the phone. You had a phone, you had a keypad before smartphones. It was the easiest interface in the world that everyone got used to. And we have to get to the same standardization and the same simplicity in this case. And I think governments have an important role to play in their own digital services to be a first mover for setting such standards and creating such simplicity. But the third role of governments is maybe more controversial. I'd be quite curious to hear about the others' views on that. We tend to accept that government has a role in providing certain infrastructure, for example, drinking water or electricity or a road system. It might be contracted out to commercial entities, but the ultimate responsibility for government for providing these kinds of infrastructures is seen as a governmental, as a state responsibility. And the same goes for our identity card system. So for us, it's unthinkable that some non-government entity might issue ID cards or passports. It is sort of a core purpose of government to issue ID cards, to keep citizens registers in city town halls and so on. In different ways in different countries, but it's always a state responsibility. Now, we could ask the question, simple ways and standardized ways and trustworthy ways of citizens to identify themselves in the digital space should also be basic infrastructure that is a responsibility of governments. Maybe not in terms of executing them, but at least in terms of setting the standards and creating those frameworks. And I think that applies both to real identities to access certain public services or e-commerce or bank accounts, but also for providing maybe privacy protecting access online, like pseudonyms or other ways. So that's really a question I'd quite like to raise, whether that should be seen as a responsibility of government to create these standardized and simple means.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you very much. Does somebody want to add something?
Yes, I would like to continue, if I may.
Sure.
I think we're all thinking along the same lines, probably. But I would also further suggest that in addition to digital identity, perhaps the government should think about taking responsibility for creating electronic social networks. We have Facebook, and I think everyone uses it or knows about it at least. I've discovered the full power of it only after lockdown happened, and it was one of the very few ways I could communicate with my friends. But the thing is that Facebook is considered to be a government asset of the United States. And the reasonable question is, why don't European governments provide social networks? Something at the local level, something where I could visit virtually my neighbor and speak with them. Something that is trusted and something that does not feed me content based on the company policies or on the policies of a foreign government. Something that created and governed, at least in part, by my elected representatives locally in the state where I reside. So that's one thing. And to answer the question about how we can determine whether text or communication is fake or not, for a long time there existed such a thing as Turing Test. And in legal context, the reason why we invite witnesses to court is because we can interrogate them. So I think we can tell fake from non-fake if we can speak to it. And if it convincingly replies to us and convinces us that it has integrity, moral values, free will, then maybe we don't care whether it's real or fake. Maybe such an entity deserves existence anyhow.
Pavel, you make me think to the famous movie Blade Runner and the book of Philip K. Dick with this Voigtkampf test, and someone on the chat mentioned that we should test also to know if you are human or not, but it's a joke apart. I think that Karen raised a hand to also contribute to this discussion. Please, Karen.
I think it's really important to look at sort of the human factor when we're looking at digital tools. There was a council meeting in the European Union of ministers where this was hacked because one of the ministers had shared the password and the link on their Twitter profile. So no matter how good our security is, it will always be if we as humans are not being careful enough, then we won't actually be able to benefit from the security. And I think it's the human factor that allowed members of the Dutch parliament to not be aware of the fact that they were talking to a digitally remastered version of Navalny and not Navalny himself. I think we also need to look at the way that platforms and social media are designed. At the moment, there are a lot of what's called dark patterns, where we are pushed to take decisions to the benefit of the platform or the company that has the platform, and where we feel we have a free choice, but we don't actually have a free choice because we're constantly nudged in one direction. When looking at the way that we want platforms to approach, then I think it would be good to have very strong requirements on interoperability between the platforms so that we have more competition between them. The example of Facebook is an evident one because, at least in many countries in Europe, Denmark included, it is a very large percentage of the population that has a Facebook account, and a lot of information is being shared also from public authorities and ministries, is being shared on Facebook and not on their websites. So I think it's a requirement for these very large online platforms to allow for interoperability and also to allow other platforms, other companies to provide access to the information that is available on these networks through an API. I recently learned that Francis Fukuyama has described this as middleware, that you have something that is in between the software of the platform and yourself that you put in the middle. It's not a man-in-the-middle attack for the cybersecurity people out there, but it's a middleware that you choose to put in between yourself and the social media platform. So you choose through which window you see the data, so that you can say, I want my time feed in a chronological manner. I want not to see advertisement. I do not want to see these kinds of clickbait titles of newspaper articles. And I think this, along with the interoperability requirements, would allow the users to regain control of the way that they experience the internet. And that would provide for more trust in the content that we see.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. Now, turning back to Claudia and Jan, perhaps you have a kind of conclusive question or concluding remarks?
Because we are
questions.
Yes, please,
questions.
Please, Claudia.
Yes, please.
I have a question for each. Although I must say I was fascinated by everything you said, to good note, and it wasn't quick enough to get everything you said. A question, I had two questions for Sebastian, but he answered already one of them. And my question was about the individuals versus the institutions. He answered brilliantly. I think that was missing in what you said. Governments could do this as well. Otherwise, we will not have enough authentication. So my question was about the scale. If the technological approach of these authentic pseudonyms can be used, how many do we need in order to make sure that we have an open public space that has the characteristics that I want? Is there a scale problem? And would we have to rely only on individuals doing this? But you partially answered by of course, prompting institutions to adopt the same. So my question is about the scale, and when are we safe? When are we okay? When do we know that we have so few contaminations, so to speak? We can use the virus example, that we are okay, that we have indeed a public space worth of the name. And this leads me to a question to Karen. Of course, I'm all for skeptical approach, critical thinking, I call it. But in order to have that, you have to have reliable and falsifiable information. So it goes back to the authenticity and the reality of the info and so of course the critical thinking is crucial, but it cannot happen in the absence of a trusted space where people think that they're using real sources and real data. So I think it takes us back to the same question. And I have a final question for Pavel. Can you do a contradictory or a counter-interrogation in the absence of a physical and simultaneous space? So in a setting that is any different from the one that you would have in a court, would you consider it as quality, as reliable, if you didn't have the two-dimensional space and time happening simultaneously?
Okay, maybe I'll pick up the question, and it's actually something that I haven't addressed earlier, your question around the scale. So how many people do we actually need to adopt a mechanism such as verified authentic pseudonyms in order to be useful? There's two answers to that. One is a practical answer, and we kind of touched on it earlier. You need a certain critical mass for such an approach to be well known, and the tools to be something that people have used before, and it's not something completely new. So a little bit like everyone now knows how to use Zoom or some other video conference. But the good news is that we do not need to transform the whole internet. We do not need everyone or almost everyone to go online with a verified pseudonym. We just need a sizable minority of people to make it worthwhile. So if you consider, for example, a news website with a news article and comments underneath, at the moment you have comments from people where you don't know whether they are bots or not bots. A very small number of sites, for example, Twitter, highlight certain users as being verified, as being real name verified. And what we are proposing with pseudonyms is sort of something in the middle, verified as a real human being, but not necessarily with their real identity. So if you take the example of Twitter, you might imagine that instead of having two categories of user accounts commenting on a tweet, you might have three categories: of the unverified, the real name verified, and the pseudonym. And it's enough for a certain proportion of people to use that feature to become useful. Because then if I go through a Twitter feed with lots and lots of tweets or lots and lots of reactions, I might choose to filter out all the unverified ones. So I only see the real name verified and the pseudonym verified contributions, because then I know these are real people, and if I engage with them, if I start a political discussion, if I try to convince them of my viewpoint, I'm actually trying to convince a real human being, and that's worth my time, and as a citizen and as a voter. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
There was also a question addressed to me regarding the skepticism, the critical thinking, and how this should be applied if we can't verify things. And I think for me, it's quite important that we make sure that, for example, journalists don't uncritically share information before it's been verified, or share things and then say we're in the process of verifying it, but that they verify first and share later, because the majority of the readers and viewers will perhaps only see the first sharing of the information and will not see the debunking of the myth or saying that this was wrong. And this kind of education of journalists and also users of thinking before you share, I think is really important, because at the current situation, I think many of us think, well, if I share information to others, then that is good in and of itself. And that's not always the case. And we need to be more aware of that. And regarding Sebastian's point about being able to filter only for verified accounts, I think that, at least from my point of view, removes some of the interactiveness of the internet, and also removes the ability of citizens to approach me as a politician if I filter out the non-verified or the non-authenticated profiles, because that creates the conversation online to only be a select crowd that are talking to each other, a little bit like before the internet.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I just want to raise a point on the chat. I just quote that. It's about how effective is education also. I quote the contribution in the chat. What 2020 has taught me is that there is many people who will believe what they want, regardless of facts, as long as it tells the stories they want to hear. We see this with vaccine, QAnon, etc. And the question is, I make this worse. How does education help? This question of education is maybe also quite important. I don't know, Karen, how do you see? Is it in school? Is it in university? In public house, where we can raise education of citizens about that?
Sure that the platforms allow us to share things in an educated way. At the moment, platforms are designed without necessarily considering the risks that their design poses for the general public and for our democratic dialogue. And I'm not wanting them to restrict the content there, but have a think about how do new functions that you introduce to the platforms, what kind of effects will they have? Test for them, keep an eye on them before you say that all is good. Because the platforms are continually rejigged, rechanged in order to not just to be the best product to sell for the people who want to use our data, but I think we really need a regulatory dialogue with the platforms, with the European authority, to say, okay, have you thought about the risks that this design feature will pose, so that the coders behind the platforms actually look at it. And this is not really a direct answer to how do we educate the public, because but it is on the other hand, because it's not just by teaching people in schools or sending out pamphlets to all of the households in a country, but it is making it easier to make educated choices as users of the internet and as citizens.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, for this. I wonder if Jan has a last question before we close the session.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, my sincere thanks to all panelists. Very, very thought-provoking. And indeed, I think as Sebastian pointed out, extremely complementary in your approach. So very useful. I'd like to end by a comparison. I don't know how many of you know this particular series. It's called Westworld. Westworld is an extremely thought-provoking series about both humanoid robotics, but also about artificial intelligence and self-learning intelligence. And the opening scene, I think, is very appropriate to our webinar, because a guest arrives in Westworld, which is a theme park inhabited by AI-endowed humanoid robots. And the guest asks one of the hosts, a gorgeous lady, incidentally played by Elon Musk's former wife, and he points the question and says, "Are you real?" And Tallulah Riley answers, "If you can't tell, does it matter?" And I think this is something to ponder in the context of deepfakes, because trust, I think, for me, was the central theme in all three presentations. The trust of people in their relations as citizens amongst themselves, and also the trust in the authorities. And I do believe there is a role for governments. There is a role for governments to ensure that that trust is maintained and that that trust is justified. I'm very happy that Pavel reassured us that during criminal proceedings, deepfakes could be analyzed. I'm less optimistic, though, that the sophisticated means of doing so would be readily available to all criminal jurisdictions and indeed applied in all criminal courts. And therefore, there is an obligation, in my view, for the state authorities to ensure that where video or audio material is presented, there is a possibility to challenge this. And that, of course, requires legislation and standards. And to come also back to Karen, who raised the question of literacy, that is, of course, absolute education is, to my mind, also a government obligation here. I'd also like to add, perhaps at the very end, that Karen mentioned a regulatory competition between the European Union and the Council of Europe. I see it very much as a complementary and hopefully also mutually reinforcing exercise, where at the moment the Commission proposals are very much aimed at the products and the producers to ensure that safe products arrive on the market. And the Council of Europe is very much looking at the obligations on governments and the rights and remedies available to citizens in case their rights are violated or they claim to be violated by this product. So I think it's both indeed. I don't think it's a competition. I think it's very, very complementary. Competition perhaps in a good sense, that we both try to deliver the best possible. So whilst recommending once more Westworld to your attention for some deeper thoughts about this, because as I said, it's really thought-provoking, and perhaps underlining the word trust is for me the key takeaway for this webinar. I thank you very much for your attention, for the questions, and please do follow also the various social media links that I think Juliette and Yannick have made available for further information on our thoughts and not only our thoughts, but the process what we're engaged in and the reflection, and for which we very much need your input as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Jan, for that. Except if there is a last word from Patrick or Claudia now, we will close the session because we run already late. I would like just to mention you our poll, because it's very interesting. I asked the question, have you ever created deepfakes with your cell phone, basically cheap fakes, and 94% of persons never use that. So we discuss a lot of phenomenon that is concentrated to experts. And last question, is it an overestimated fears or a real threat? I asked that to the audience. For 75%, we should deal with that immediately in a concrete way. And I think that today our experts show a balanced way to deal with the part of technological answer and the part, of course, of political and legal answer too. Juliette?
Yeah, quite fascinating are the answers to the polls. Thank you for sharing that with us, Yannick. This will be the last words. Thank you to everyone for contributing to this webinar, especially to our three speakers. The next webinar will take place after the summer in September. We don't have the exact time for now, but it will be, in September sometime. And it will deal with artificial intelligence investigative methods and investigative tools in very different contexts. So I say goodbye for now. Have a nice summer. And thank you again to everyone.
And thanks again, warm thanks to all our speakers, because again, we are closing now. I think we can spend again hours, and for sure, we will continue the discussion. If you wish, we have plenty of questions on the chat, but do not hesitate to ask us questions, and we will publish on the website a short resume of this session. Thanks a lot for that. I launched the intro. Have a very nice and wonderful summer despite the crisis. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.